Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be talking about how to use a mortiser and specific a benchtop mortiser. So first off, there are a few different types of mortisers out there. There are the smaller benchtop models which are generally around 110 volt, which is exactly what I've got here. There's also much larger industrial sized mortisers, which are, you might have seen them if you watch like Andy Rawls, his YouTube channel. He has a big beast of an old school mortiser that can handle, giant mortising chisels and all that. Now those much larger mortisers are completely different from the machine than what I've got here, but they still follow the exact same principles, which we're going to be going over in this video here. And so this video is not going to be a review of this mortiser in specific, because there's a lot of stuff that I want to talk about with this mortiser compared to some of the other ones that I've tried, and so I'm going to be making a whole review video about this Powermatic mortiser coming sometime in the future here or there. But I feel like it is very important to understand that before you get into using a mortiser, that there are some downsides and upsides to it. So very often mortisers are compared directly to the Festool Domino for joinery because they both create the same form of joint, a mortise and tenon joint. Now a mortiser creates a traditional mortise joint with a square mortise that you then cut a tenon onto a piece of wood, and that creates your mortise and tenon joint. With a domino joiner, you're using a floating mortise and tenon, which means you have two solid pieces of wood and then a floating piece of wood that goes in between the two, and it creates a floating mortise and tenon joint. So they do create basically the exact same form of joint. Now when you're choosing on a form of joinery to use in your shop, your mortise and tenon joinery is one of the most traditional forms of joinery within woodworking, and so you need to either use something like a mortiser, or you can hand cut mortises, or something like dowels or a domino. All of those options are very good, and they all serve the exact same purpose within the wood shop. And so when you're trying to make the decision as to whether or not to get a domino or a mortiser, it's very important to understand what you're getting with both. So one of the first things I can say about that is that a mortiser is definitely a much more old school way of working. It's a little bit less efficient, takes a lot of time and maintenance to upkeep it, and doesn't really have any massive benefits over the domino joiner, other than it allows you to make drawboard mortise and tenon joints. Which is something that I personally really like. Now when you look at the domino, what you can do is you can create that mortise and tenon joint a lot faster. It's a lot more cost effective because you're not having to use solid wood to make those joints. It requires a lot less machinery. To make a true mortise and tenon joint, you need something like a mortiser or hand tools. You're going to need a table saw to cut that tenon. It takes a lot more stuff, whereas with the domino joiner, you're just creating the joint with two cuts here and there. So that's the big difference there. A domino joiner is going to be more expensive compared directly just to the mortiser, because a domino joiner, I think here in Canada, is around $1,200, whereas this mortiser that I've got here, which is a top-of-the-line benchtop mortiser, is around $860. But what you also have to keep in mind with a mortiser is that you're going to have to buy a dado stack or a tenoning jig for your table saw. You're going to need a table saw to make those tenons. All that kind of stuff coming together. It can be almost as expensive and less efficient than a domino joiner. Now, all that being said, the reason I have a mortiser and not a domino joiner is just because I like the traditional methods here. I like the traditional idea of mortise and tenon joints. Same reason why I like to use my hand plane for a lot of my finishing work. I just didn't find that old school method a little bit more enjoyable. And so because this is an old school machine, it does take some technical skills to actually operate it. Again, comparing it to the domino joiner is meant to be a production tool. You just line up the marks and it very simply cuts a mortise for you. Whereas with the mortiser here, you need to know how to actually get to the proper depth. You need to know how to sharpen the chisels. You need to know how much material you can take out in a certain bite. All that kind of stuff. And so it's very important to understand how your machine works before you just jump into using it. And so before we can actually talk about how to use this thing, we need to talk about how the bits that go in it actually work. So the bits that go in a mortiser are called mortising chisels, and they are a two-part bit made up of an auger that goes in the center and a chisel that makes up the outside and actually cuts the square hole. So the idea here is that the auger bit clears out a circular area of material, clears out the majority of the waste, and then the square chisel comes in and cuts that nice clean square hole of the surrounding area. And so the auger bit clears out the majority of the waste, and then the chisel comes in and squares up that hole, leaving you with a nice square mortise. And so just like any other tool in your shop, you are going to need to go through quite a bit of maintenance in order to make sure that this bit is staying nice and sharp. So we're going to jump over to the drill press right now, and I will show you guys just how to go about sharpening the mortising chisel here. So at the drill press now, there's a few things you're going to need before you can actually sharpen your bits. First off, obviously you're going to need a drill press, and you want to make sure that you can get a drill press that has a variable speed setting to it. So on most of the cheaper drill presses, what you're going to do is you're just going to open up the lid, and there'll be this little belt that goes on the inside, and you'll have the scale that'll show you what speeds you're on. what you want to make sure of is that you can go down to about 500 RPM speed. So my drill press here, the lowest speed is about 570. The second lowest is 900. Either one of those should work just fine. And so all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to move the belt down. You got to be very careful not to actually damage your motor here when you're moving this belt. Just take it one step at a time and move it to its slowest speed. So I've had the most luck on the 570 RPM. But again, if your drill press can only go down to 900 or 1000 RPM, that also works too. But you have to be very careful on how hot you're letting the sharpening cone get, which we'll talk about in just a sec here. And so the next thing you're going to need is a diamond sharpening cone. Now these are a diamond covered cone that get mounted into your drill press chuck. Now the whole point of these things is to sharpen mortising chisels. They have no other purpose, and they are fairly inexpensive for what they are, given the fact that they are coated in diamonds, and you can pick them up from pretty much anywhere where you can buy mortising chisels. Now, the one thing that you need to be aware of is some of these diamond sharpening cones are very specific to their brand of mortising chisels. So the only ones that I can really find here in Canada are from Lee Valley, and they're the ones I highly recommend. Lee Valley has a premium line of mortising chisels, and those are the only ones that I would actually recommend to anyone, because they're the only ones that I've used and I've had really good success with them, and they just are readily available, and you can buy replacement parts for them, which is very, very important. And so from Lee Valley, you can also buy the diamond sharpening cone that fits them exactly. They fit perfectly right off the bat. They're the same ones that the factory uses to sharpen those chisels, so they all work out just fine. If in the future you buy a different brand of mortising chisels, I think Powermatic has their own line. I think there's a bunch of other brands that make mortising chisels. You can use the same sharpening cones on them, but you will have to do some initial work on them in order to make the cone actually fit, which just means that you have to run the cone for a little bit in order to change the internal geometry of those chisels to fit the specific cone that you have. And so just like any other drill bit, all you're going to do is just mount it into the chuck of your drill press and tighten it up. And you want to make sure that you've got a good connection in there, because you don't want this thing coming loose while you're trying to sharpen those chisels. The next thing you're going to need is a drill press vise. Now these things are, again, very inexpensive. You can buy them on Amazon. They're about 30 bucks. And all this is going to do is lock the chisel in place. If you don't have a drill press and you don't want to put all the money invested into it, you can do this whole process with just a simple benchtop vise and a hand drill. It doesn't work as well from what I understand. I've never done it that way because I always wanted to do it right. The big benefit of a drill press is that it's going to make sure that you get a nice even sharpness around the whole edge of your chisel. Whereas with a drill, you can end up leaning it either way, and it's not as efficient of a way of sharpening compared to something like a drill press. And so with a drill press vise, they generally have these long slots in them that allow you to put some bolts in to attach them to your table. With your smaller drill presses that you can buy at Home Depot and that, they aren't generally going to have a large enough table to actually use those slots, so I just use some quick clamps and hold them in place. That's more than strong enough for what I need. And so one of the things you need to watch out for is you need to make sure that you're aligning everything properly. And so the best way to align your drill press vise is to just sit it on your table, take your mortising chisel, and just drop it in and make sure that your table is down far enough so that you can get that mortising bit in there with enough clearance. And so luckily enough for me, the butt end of my mortising chisel, the part that actually goes into the chuck of the mortiser, is the exact same size as the hole in the table of my drill press. So it lines up nicely, and there's a little bit of movement in there, so I just have to watch out for that. But I can use that to help align everything else. So again, putting my drill press vise on the table here, I can just drop that in there. And so I want to start by actually aligning the table so that that hole is centered up on the cone here. And so just simply by lowering the cone sharpener into the mortising chisel, I know that that's forcing that chisel to be centered, because I know that my drill press table is at a perfect 90 degrees to where the quill is coming down on the drill press. And so it's all pushing everything in a nice straight alignment so that I know that it's going to be perfectly vertical when I start sharpening. And so another important part of this is you want to try and find, a couple pieces of leather or just scrap pieces of wood to put in between the jaws of your vise and the mortise chisel itself, because you don't want to clamp down on the mortise, the bare metal of the mortise chisel, because that can damage it pretty easily. So having a little something soft in there, whether it's a little wad of paper, some leather, or a little piece of wood, anything like that is going to help. And so then I can very easily just tighten up my vise until I get it perfectly aligned. And so once I've got my vise tightened up, I can lower down the drill press here and kind of align things so that everything is sitting nice and straight and square, and we should be good to go. Now all I need to do is just clamp down the vise in a couple places to make sure it's not going to move around on me when I actually turn the machine on. And so then the last thing you're going to want to do here is just take some 3-in-1 oil. If you don't have 3-in-1 oil in your shop, get some. It's very helpful for everything from keeping your hand planes well maintained to sharpening stuff. Just all around, 3-in-1 oil is going to be your friend in woodworking. And so what I like to do, I like to just put a little dab on my finger and just wipe it around the point of the cone sharpener. You are going to get a little bit messy doing this, but again, that's just part of woodworking. And so what you're trying to do when you're sharpening the bit here is you're going for a very, very fine burr. You just want to barely knock a little bit of metal off this so that it's sharp. A few times now on some of my mortising chisel, I've actually broken the points off the chisel itself, and so I've had to resharpen in that point, which takes quite a long time, but it's very important to actually have those points on there. So what you're going to do, just turn the drill press on, nice and simple, make sure everything's running fine, and then just lightly lower it down into the chisel. And so you don't actually want to apply any hard pressure with your drill press because you can cause a lot of damage really quickly to both the sharpening stone and your chisel. You just want to let it just slowly cut away at the material. And then you'll know you're done when you have a very small burr formed on all 4 sides of your mortising chisel. And so if you're checking it and that burr isn't forming evenly on all 4 sides, it's not that big of a deal. It just means that your mortise chisel is not perfectly centered, or it could be that the lowering action of your drill press is not perfectly straight. A whole number of things can come together, but as long as it's mostly even, if you're getting it where it's, on the back side, you're getting a massive burr forming before anything is even cutting on the front side, that's going to be a big problem, and you're going to want to go through and recheck everything else. But as long as you have an even burr on all 4 sides, it's fine. It's going to be, it's not that big of a deal. And so there's a lot of setup and prep. If you're using your mortiser a lot, I would highly recommend getting multiple of the same size chisel. Say you're doing a project and you're cutting, hundreds of half-inch mortises, and you're going to be using your mortiser for all that. Get a couple half-inch mortiser chisels, because that way you can just switch between those, and then you can have one big sharpening stage where you go through, set everything up, sharpen them all at once. Then you can go back to your mortiser and run them at the same time. I currently only have one of each size that I typically use because I don't generally cut a ton of mortises at a time. But again, if I was going to be cutting a lot of mortises into a project, I would probably go out and pick up another mortising chisel. That way I could just switch in between and it makes life a little bit easier. And so now that we have that burr formed on all 4 sides of our mortiser chisel here, we need to go through and get rid of it to make sure that this thing is sharp all the way around. And so now I can just move over to my normal sharpening stones that I would use to sharpen my chisels or any other tool in my shop. And so I can just clean up that burr really easily. And so the other important thing here is you need to take the time to clean off all the oil off your chisel, because mixing that 3-in-1 oil on your water stones is going to ruin them really badly. So just make sure you clean it all off. Just use a paper towel, whatever you got, clean off the inside, wherever you can, as much oil as you can possibly get off is great. If you want to take the time to use some degreaser to really get that oil off there, that's even better practice. But yeah, as long as it doesn't feel oily to the touch, you should be fine. I've never really had any major issues, but if you have like drips of oil and that on there, it will damage your water stones if that's what you're using. And so then for the last part of the sharpening, you need to sharpen the auger bit. Now the auger bit doesn't need to be sharpened as often as that outer chisel because the auger bit is a little bit of a more brute force cutting action compared to the fine precision of that outer chisel. Which also the chisel has to do a lot more cutting action, whereas a drill bit is just very much so designed to cut easily compared to that square chisel that has to cut those outer edges. And so very simply, you won't have to sharpen your auger bits nearly as often as you're going to have to sharpen those outer chisels, but it is something that you're going to need to do every once in a while. So the best way to do it is to put it in some kind of vise. Normal benchtop vise works well. I've got my Moxon vise already set up on my bench here, and it works really well for this because it's nice and long and gives me a good hold on the bit here. And so then to sharpen this, you're just going to need a very fine grit file. And so all I've got here is just a nice cheap diamond shaped file that has a couple different grits on it. So one side is a very rough grit, another side is a very fine grit, and then the third one is who knows what. And so all I'm going to do here is very carefully run my file across the top edge of this cutting edge. It's very easy to tell what the cutting edge is on your auger bit. It's the very last edge on the bit that looks like it's what would do the cutting. You don't ever really need to worry about sharpening the middle point because that's never really going to get dull. As long as it's got a nice sharp point on it, it's going to guide the bit just fine. It's really only this cutting edge that you need to worry about. And all I'm going to do is just run the file lightly across that outer edge. And so I'm going to start on the top here. And so then once I've done the top and I've removed that and I can feel a small burr formed on the underside, I'm going to go in again with my fine grit side here on the underside, and this is why it's really important to have a very small file. And I'm just going to do the same thing. And so you might have to do a couple passes here and there, so do like 2 passes on the top, 2 passes on the bottom, and then 1 more pass on the top side. You just want to make sure that you can't feel a burr on that edge. As long as there's no burr on that edge, you're good to go. What you're trying to do here anytime you're sharpening these tools is you're just trying to remove those burrs. This is not particularly a sharp cutting edge, so you just need to make sure that that burr is not going to get in the way of its cutting action. Other than that, this auger bit is now fully ready to go. And so with both parts of our bit nice and sharp, we can put it back together and actually load it up into the mortiser here. So anytime you're installing a bit into any machine in your shop, blade, bit, whatever it may be, make sure you unplug the machine or have it powered off in a way that it takes at least 2 separate actions to turn on. So for this mortiser, to turn this thing on, it's only 1 switch. That's not great. You want to make sure that, for me I always wear a hat in the shop, and I have turned this machine on by accident with my hat. I've also turned it off, which is kind of annoying. So just as proof of concept here, I do have the power cord right here that you guys can see. The machine is unplugged while I'm installing the bit. And so depending on what brand or model of mortiser you get will kind of change up the install of the bit here. But one of the main reasons that I chose this Powermatic one when I was shopping around is because it has these little wing separators here, which you just fold in and it gives you the proper spacing for your auger bit and chisel. When you're installing your bit into your mortiser, what you want to make sure of is that that auger bit is protruding slightly past the corners of the chisel there. Because normally you can see that the auger bit just fully seats into the chisel here, but if you try to cut like this, it's not going to work. That bit is going to be jamming up against the chisel, and it's just not going to cut nicely. So you want to make sure that that auger bit is sticking out past the chisel and is able to clear that circular area of material before the square chisel has to come in and remove all that excess material around it. And so on this Powermatic mortiser, it's got these little wing spacers that you just push in here, and so it just lets you leave that spacing just without having to really think about it. If your mortiser doesn't have these little spacers, all you have to do is just use like an 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch setup block, depending on what size of mortising chisel you're using, and just create that spacing yourself. It's really not that hard, or you can just make sure visually that auger bit is sticking out past the edge of the mortise chisel there. And so then you want to just go through and make sure that your chuck is open wide enough to actually accept the throat of the auger bit, because that auger bit has to go fully in there. So just make sure it's open enough. I'm switching the machine currently from a 1/4 inch up to this 3/8 of an inch, so I just open it up a little bit to make sure that I can fit the auger bit into the chuck here. And so then using a piece of wood, you want to just put that right on the end and push both the auger bit and the mortise chisel as tightly together as they'll go. Then you can feed them up in and align the auger bit into the chuck. And so when you're tightening the chuck onto the auger bit, you want to make sure to just spin it around a couple times and tighten it from all 3 sides. Most mortisers and drill presses nowadays have a 3-jaw chuck to make sure that the bit gets perfectly centered in them. But it's also important to tighten the chuck from all 3 sides to make sure that you get nice even pressure going around that bit. And so with the auger bit installed in the chuck, we can now take the block of wood away, and you can see that the chisel just sits there on the auger bit and doesn't move around a lot. So we can spin it, we can do everything with it that we need to, but it's not going to fall off, which is always a good thing. If your chisel is falling off, that means that your auger bit is not properly sized to that chisel, and you're going to need to either get a new auger bit or get a new chisel set completely, because there's something seriously wrong. So that chisel should never fall off of that auger bit. You should always be able to put the auger bit inside the chisel and hold on to the end of the auger bit and have that chisel hang there nicely. So then we can remove that little separator right there and push the chisel itself up and just temporarily lock it. So one of the really important things, you need to make sure that this chisel is square to the fence that's on your machine, which we're going to do in a later step here. But again, we want to make sure that we go through and just double check that everything is tightened up all nicely and everything is holding in nice and firmly. And so with the bit installed into our mortiser here, we can grab our workpiece and actually move into the final setup here. So this part of the setup is always going to change depending on whatever workpiece you're using. So one of the downsides to a benchtop or a more basic model of mortiser like I've got here is that it takes a lot more time and effort to set up, and it require a little bit more manual effort to use. Some of your higher end, really fancy mortisers are going to have a table with all your X, Y, and Z axis. So you just clamp your piece in, you got all your little hand wheels that you move to align it. For this mortiser, all I'm going to do is just manually align everything. And so the first thing I want to do here is I want to align the fence. So first off, I'm just going to put the fence out a little ways, put my piece of stock in there, and then I'm going to align my mortise chisel to wherever I want it to be. Again, I'm not going to go through the effort of marking out the lines and all that on this piece of scrap wood because I don't particularly care where it ends up. I just kind of want to show you guys what the heck is happening. So then I can just lower the head of my mortiser to get my bit a little bit closer to where I want it. Then again, sneak up on the fence to get it, I'm just going to try and basically center it on the piece here just visually, and I'm going to lock down my fence. So the fence on this mortiser has two separate locking levers. Again, make sure they're both locked down nice and tight so that fence isn't wobbling around. Next thing you're going to want to do, again, with your stock in place is you're going to want to take your stock lock or whatever the heck it's called. I usually could just call it a stock lock and put it down on this bolt on the back. So what this piece does is because when you're raising the mortiser back up and pulling that bit out of the wood, there's a lot of pressure being exerted on it. Again, this bit gets very hot when it's in use, so there's a lot of tension between the wood and that mortise chisel. And so what this piece does that we're installing right now is it just prevents the piece from raising up when you're trying to pull the mortise chisel out of that hole that you're cutting. And so the best way to install this is to put it in place and put something like a business card between the piece of wood and that lock there. Then you can tighten it up and you should be good to go. A lot of the time, these locks will have a secondary nut to make sure that it has some extra reinforcement, more so than just the bolt that it has in it. So you're just going to install that nut and make sure it's down nice and tight. Then when you pull away the business card, you should still be able to freely move your stock back and forth, but you shouldn't be able to lift it up a lot. You can feel a little bit of vertical movement in there, but if you can actually pick it up, that's going to be a problem. But you want to make sure that you can still move your piece freely back and forth. And so the next thing is to install the guide wheels. So these are what's going to keep the stock nice and tight up against the fence and make sure that you keep good alignment. So these just simply align into the T-track here. I say simply, but they are a little bit finicky to actually get in. And so all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to apply some pressure to the back, tighten up the bolts so that these wheels are holding the stock nice and tight up against the fence. Now, I'm a huge fan of these rubber wheels that Powermatic chose to use on here because they allow the stock to freely move side to side. I can still move it around with a little bit of resistance, but not too much that it's hard to use. But it also keeps the stock really well supported up against the back of the fence there. So both those things together make it a really good method. So then once you've got all your stock supports in place, your fence is locked down, you've got the locking bars in place, you've got your wheels up against the stock, and it's nice and tightly fitted. One of the last things you're going to do here is just pull the piece all the way back so that it's very close to being where the mortise chisel is going to come down. Then you can go way back in and loosen off the locking lever that's holding the mortise chisel in place, because now you're going to square up the chisel and get it nice and perfectly squared up to the edge of the fence, or square to the end of your board is what we're going to be doing here. Because you have two different options. You can either square it up to your fence, which in the case of this mortiser is actually quite complicated because there's a big hole right in the middle there. So that's a little bit annoying. But the easiest way that I found to do this is as long as you have a piece of stock where you know that the end grain is cut perfectly perpendicular to the side grains of your wood, so everything's going to come out nice and square. And anytime you're using a mortiser, you want to be dealing with as square a stock as possible. This method works great. So all you're going to do is just lightly push your material up against your mortise chisel and just make sure that that face is flat up against it, and then lock it back in place. Again, this is the most foolproof method I've found. It's way easier than trying to square it up exactly to the fence. And again, the thing to understand about the way that this is going to cut mortises is if it's a little bit, if you're a degree off of the angle, it's not perfectly 90 degrees, that's not going to affect anything because it's just the way that the machine cuts, the way that any mortising machine cuts. It's not that big of a deal if your mortise chisel is a little bit off. You can always cut your tens just slightly thinner to fit there perfectly. But again, If you're someone that is just super crazy about getting that perfect angle, you can always grab a square and perfectly align it to your fence if you really want to, but that does take a lot longer compared to this method here. And so when you're squaring up your bit, you have two separate options. You have the traditional method and how the manufacturer tells you to set it up, and you have the real world method, which is how most woodworkers are going to tell you to set it up. So most manufacturers are going to tell you to have the opening of your chisel pointed to either the left or the right so that it's dumping chips onto the board. That's a really stupid thing because then it clogs up the area that you're working. It literally dumps chips back into the mortise that you're trying to cut and makes the whole machine work harder to clear out those chips. So don't know why manufacturers tell you to do that. It's really dumb. What you should do instead is have that hole pointed towards the front. And again, this is what most woodworkers are going to tell you, because what this does is it creates a small pile of chips right in the front of the board that you can then brush away with your hand and clean up the area completely. You're not dumping chips back into the mortise that you're trying to cut. So that's a very important tip. And so the next thing we're going to do is set up the depth stop on our mortiser here. And so I've already gone through and marked on my piece of stock where I want to set up the mortise chisel. And so what you want to do is you always want to set your mortise chisel to be 1/4 of an inch deeper than whatever mortise you're trying to cut. So if you're trying to cut a 3/4 inch mortise, you're going to want to go 1 inch deep into the wood, or set that line 1 inch deep into the wood anyway. Because what happens is the bottom of the mortise that you're going to be cutting with this mortiser is not going to be perfectly flat. It's actually going to be quite thick. There's going to be a hole and there's going to be a lot of little nastiness to the bottom of it. It's not going to be a pretty mortise. So if you cut it to that exact 3/4 inch depth that you're going for, it's not actually going to end up being, you're not actually going to be able to fit a 3/4 of an inch tenon into that mortise. So you always want to go at least 1/4 of an inch deeper. It may depend on the mortiser and the mortise chisels that you have. You're going to have to play around with it, but from my experience with all the mortise chisels that I have, that adding that 1/4 of an inch works every single time. So whatever it may be, 3/4 of an inch makes it 1 inch deep. And so I've got this line marked on here at about 3/4 of an inch deep because I'm aiming for a 1/2 inch mortise. And so when I'm figuring where I want my depth stop, all I'm going to do is I'm going to put the points of that mortise chisel right on that line, because that's going to tell me exactly where I need the thing to be. Then I can bring my depth stop up, and most depth stops on these benchtop mortisers are going to be very simple mechanisms. They're just going to tighten down right on the back area of the mortiser to prevent the head from going any deeper than what you want. And so then the final thing before you start cutting is setting the handle properly. So again, some mortisers have this option, some don't. But again, on this mortiser, I have this lovely option, and I didn't learn about this until way too long after getting it. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to loosen this knob here. And so this is a spring-loaded mechanism on this machine where you just kind of pull out the arm. And so you want to bring your head down to its depth stop. And what you want is for this arm to be basically down to your waist height. So I know you guys can't really see it on the camera here, but when I pull this arm down and I've hit my depth stop here, the lever arm of the mortiser is right about at my waist. And so then when I bring it up, I know that it's going to be right about at my shoulder line for when the chisel is out of the wood. You want this thing as low as it possibly can be because that's going to give you the most leverage. If your lever arm is up here and you're trying to pull it down, that gives you the least amount of leverage, and it's going to do a really, really good workout on your upper arm. And so now we've got our machine all set up, ready to go to start cutting our mortises. So the important thing to understand about a mortiser here is that they're not a fast or super, quick, efficient machine. They are efficient in the sense that you don't have to go back in and like square up mortises like you would off like a Domino or a router, but they are a very slow cutting machine because they are meant to cut a square mortise, and that's literally their only purpose. I don't think that they've been redesigned since like the 1800s when they were first made. So they are a very simple machine that is meant to work at a certain pace, and you have to respect that. That speed that you're going to be working at is also going to change depending on the wood that you're using. The piece that I've got loaded up in here is a piece of hard maple. So hard maple is just about the worst thing to use on a mortiser because it is super hard and annoying, and it forces you to sharpen your bits way more often. If you go back to the project where I built the maple dresser, that was a long, long project, and I learned one of the hardest lessons I've ever learned with this mortiser, and that is how important it is to have replacement auger bits for your mortising chisels. And so what I ended up doing in that project is I pushed the mortise chisel a little bit too hard, and I broke the end of the auger bit. And so luckily, the ones that I bought from Lee Valley, very easily from Lee Valley, all you have to do is call them up, and you can just simply order new replacement auger bits for, I think it was like $15 compared to the $80 that the whole new chisel set would have cost. So that is a big benefit, and again, one of the big reasons why I recommend buying mortise chisels from Lee Valley is because you want to make sure that you are able to get the replacement auger bits. If you're not able to get replacement auger bits, don't buy the mortise chisels. Again, biggest point I can emphasize here, you are going to break those auger bits every once in a while. Just they're going to get too hot, especially on your smaller sizes. I think it was the 1/4 inch one here that I ended up breaking the auger bit on. Again, very small size, very easy to break. And so on any of your softer woods, you really don't have to have that much restraint when you're using this thing. You really can just punch through those mortises nice and quick. Even on woods like cherry and walnut, I haven't had any real issues with this thing. You do have to slow down slightly compared to soft woods, but again, nothing super crazy. On woods like white oak and maple, you really have to slow down, take your time, and be very cautious of burning. If you start smelling that sweet smoke smell that you'll get from when maple starts burning, then you, again, slow it down, make your process nice and slow, make your cutting nice and slow as you possibly can go without things jamming up or causing burning because you're going too slow. You want to choose your pace, and again, this is something that'll come with practice. And I highly recommend, if you're just starting out with a mortiser, start with pine, then move up to like cherry or walnut, something a little bit softer. Then make your way up to white oak or maple, and in a while, once you've gotten some experience with the machine. So I think I've talked enough through this video. So we're going to go through and do our final checks. Again, anytime you've gone through inside of a machine, it's always good to do some final checks before you go through and actually turn it on. So first off, I'm going to check that my chuck is locked in. So I just want to go through, hit all 3 sides, make sure it's nice and tight. We're all good to go there. Make sure your chuck key is out of the chuck. Close the door for safety purposes. Next up, I want to check that my auger bit is protruding just slightly past the ends of my chisel here. So I can see visually, yes, I've got that space there. Good to go. I want to make sure that my mortise chisel is locked firmly in place, not wobbling around. Again, good to go. Next up is all of our stock support elements are kind of all in one go. So our fence isn't wobbling around, our lock is not wobbling around, and our wheels are firmly in place. Our stock is being held nice and tightly in place. You will see a little bit of wobble in there. Again, not that big of a deal. Last thing you want to check before cutting is that your depth stop is actually locked in place. So pull the head down, apply a little bit of pressure, and you should not see the head go past that depth stop. Again, we're all good to go, so we're good to plug this thing back in and actually make some mortises here. And so you can see there just how easily maple burns. Again, I'm not pushing too hard. It just maple is one of those woods that just seems to ignite very easily. And there's not any fire, there's not even really any burning in the wood itself. It's really just the chips getting caught up in between the auger bit and the chisel itself and just starting to smoke. So one of the things I do like about working with maple in the mortiser is that it makes the shop smell like you're baking in the kitchen. It's just a lovely, lovely smell. And so really the last important thing to talk about when using a mortiser is that you never want to punch your mortise side by side by side. And so you can see on this piece how I punched into one spot, then I left about 1/4 inch, then punched into another spot. And I would do that all the way along until I reached the end of whatever width mortise I wanted. And so then once I have that full length of that mortise all laid out in those individual holes, then I can go back in and clear out those middle sections. The reason for this is because if I went and punched the chisel into one hole and then I moved over to the same width as the chisel, that chisel is going to get bent back into that hole that you already cut. So when you do it this way, you're going to be cutting a nice square hole, you're going to move over and leave a 1/4 inch gap, punch another hole, and that chisel again is going to go straight down. And so then when you go back in to cut that middle section out, your chisel isn't going to have material on the left or the right side, so it'll be able to go straight down and follow that material because it'll be guided by the sidewalls. And there won't be any resistance on the left or the right side, which is very, very important. Again, this is a very easy way to break your auger bit or even your chisel. If you're cutting the holes too close together on your first pass, you are going to end up forcing that bit to curve a little bit, and you can bend it, you can damage it, or you can even break it. So you need to make sure that you're leaving that small spacing in between your holes, then go back in and clean them up. And so generally speaking, that spacing that you want to leave between each of your holes is about half the size of your bit. So I've got a 3/8 of an inch bit in here, so I want to leave that area about 3/16 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch usually works just fine. So as long as you're leaving that small spacing in there, you're going to be good to go. And so now you can see here how I've got a little pile of sawdust formed right on the front of the mortiser here, and my mortise is pretty much empty of sawdust. There's a little bit in there that's going to fall out, but overall it's not getting clogged up. It's not clogging up my mortise with all that sawdust. It's building up right in the front of my table, and I can just brush it away or blow it away with compressed air or get it with a vacuum. Really any way is much better than having that opening to the left or the right, like I was saying earlier. So now we have our fully cut out mortise, and we're good to go and cut our tenon joint, which again, not going to cover cutting tenons in this video because there's thousands of different ways to do it, and that's a video all on its own. This is just about how to use a mortiser. So if you have any questions on this process, if you think I missed anything, feel free to leave a comment down below or reach out to me on my website. I'm always happy to answer questions over there. And yeah, so I do hope you guys found this video enjoyable and a little bit helpful. And if there's any other tutorials, any other machines you want me to explain in my shop here, I'd be more than happy to make a video about those. So just again, let me know what you're looking for. So as always, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.